Trump has found a scapegoat and the American leader is blaming Zelensky. I
am a bit disappointed that President Zelensky still hasn't read our proposal. As of a few hours ago, he hadn't read it.
The finish line is near, Kala assures. Peace is already close.
There is already an almost fully formed framework of the agreement on the table, and only 2 key points remain to be decided.
A new course in the US, Washington warns the EU.
The Donald Trump administration states directly the US is stepping back from its role as Europe's main protector and is focused on restoring stability in relations with Russia.
America will abandon Ukraine, Europe warns Zelensky. In
the EU, there are fears that the US will force through a deal and that Zelensky, exhausted by the war, will make concessions without real security guarantees. And Ukraine will be left one-on-one with the Kremlin.
Kadyrov, furious, promises revenge.
There are no casualties, but a high-rise was hit. A painful slap in the face to the regime. Chechnya is boiling, the Kremlin is nervous.
Shock live on air. Propagandists are calling for a purge of Ukraine.
It's significantly much easier to completely clear the entire territory of the remaining scum that still remains there. Well, yes, it's very cynical, but it's a pragmatic move.
Are Indians coming to Russia?
Russia is ready to accept an unlimited number of migrants from India. After Putin's visit to India, the government announced that industry is facing a shortage. 800,000 workers are needed, plus another 1.5 million for construction and the service sector.
The dictatorship is over. A military parade was held in Syria to mark the anniversary of the regime's overthrow. All this and more. We discuss this and more in the episode of Main News on the YouTube channel Ukraine Today. Don't forget to like this episode. That way more viewers will see us. Well, friends, it looks like Trump woke up on the wrong side of the bed again, as usual. The US president claimed that Russia had supposedly agreed to a peace plan, while Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky hasn't even read it. By the way, President Volodymyr Zelensky himself stated that peace talks have reached a dead end precisely because of the territorial issue. It seems that Zelensky's talks with EU leaders are also not far from this dead end. According to the latest information, the leaders have already dispersed, but for now they refuse to talk to the press or answer journalist questions. They are refusing. Today we'll also talk about the results of Putin's visit to India. Why did it happen right now? And we'll discuss what Putin got out of it and whether Modi took Putin to the cleaners. Modi. And there's yet another unpleasant piece of news for Putin. The International Criminal Court confirms that arrest warrants for Putin and 5 other Russian citizens accused of war crimes are still in effect. In Ukraine, they will remain in force even if, as part of peace negotiations under the auspices of the US, a comprehensive amnesty is adopted. Let's take a look at a report covering all these news stories, a brief overview, and then we'll discuss them in the studio.
Trump is abandoning, or rather betraying Europe. Washington no longer wants to be the main guarantor of the EU's security. According to Western media reports, the Trump administration has informed European allies in closed-door meetings that after 2027, the US will no longer be the main force in NATO. Responsibility for the alliance's defense will supposedly fall solely on Europe's own shoulders.
This event marks a dramatic shift that puts Europe on a strict countdown, given the ongoing war in Ukraine and the uncertainty surrounding transatlantic security.
However, despite all the alarm for European leaders, such behavior from the White House administration did not come as a surprise. The Pentagon had already warned that it plans to reduce its role in NATO's defense. Now, however, it sounded like a tough ultimatum.
But in essence, he is stepping back from NATO, then narrowing the focus and concentrating on changing the mainstream centrist forces in Europe. And he declares that the United States will play a more active role in influencing such changes. And
the Trump administration does not plan to reduce the number of American troops in Europe.
The United States is and remains our most important ally in the alliance. However, the NATO bloc is focused on addressing political and security issues.
In fact, the ultimatum presented to the member countries of the alliance is actually to their own advantage. In reality, the Pentagon will only reduce the number of high-ranking American officers in NATO's command structure. Some of these positions will be transferred to Europeans. And Donald Trump also wants the EU to start buying weapons from the US.
Among the winners in terms of time, resources, and attention are the Western Hemisphere and possibly the Pacific region. Sorry, but among the losers is Europe. It's coming out at a loss. This administration is basically saying good luck to all of you.
But there's no need to worry. Unlike Europe, Ukraine will always have everything it needs from Trump: weapons and support. Despite the strategic pivot, American officials swear weapons deliveries to Kyiv are not being suspended, and a significant increase is even expected by Christmas.
A list of Ukraine's priority needs. The Ukrainian side submits a request for what is most urgently needed right now, and the purchase is made.
It seems Trump has finally given up on the idea of talking sense into Putin. So, on the eve of 2026, the American president has decided to move on to Plan B, the famous peace through strength.
Russia is ramping up the intensity of its hybrid attacks. But the Kremlin thug only understands the language of force.
Only. That's why any attempts to negotiate after yet another aggressive scenario from Russia, like this one, for example, Putin will interpret as weakness, as Europe's weakness, and will push even harder.
However, no matter how hard Putin presses on Europe, he himself is under pressure. Much stronger pressure.
This war has been going on for 4 years now, and over 1 million lives have been lost. There. They will never conquer Ukraine. And as for resources, look at what Nabiullina said. What did she say a week ago? We need to fight not for money anymore, but for patriotism. Yes, all the regions from which people are fighting have started to receive large sums of money. And in addition to the military-industrial complex working there in 3 shifts, on top of that, people are paid big money to fight on the front lines. But it's not a bottomless barrel.
Meanwhile, analysts assure that Ukraine will continue to receive military aid from the US and our European partners.
Judging by the position of Donald Trump himself, even if he says, "This is not my war, I will not take part in it," he is still profiting from this war, and he will continue to profit from it. And he will sell these weapons to the Europeans, and the Europeans will pay and supply these weapons to you.
And no matter how many loud statements are made in the White House regarding NATO, it will not affect Ukraine in any way. After all, Trump needs us to create his ideal image as a peacemaker, much more than it might seem. At the same time as the strikes deep into Russia become more regular, support for the American president himself is also growing.
Donald Trump has no other options. Either he has to distance himself, but he won't be able to, because in America there will be midterm elections in a year. In America, public opinion, master of its own, supports Ukraine, and that includes among his own supporters. That's why he'll have to maneuver. He won't be as categorical as we heard at the very beginning of his term.
Political technologist Oleg Pasternak is joining us next. Oleg, hello. I'm very glad to see you.
Greetings, everyone.
Negotiations have reached a dead end, he says. That's according to the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, and this was entirely predictable, both for us and for you. Even at the very beginning of this peacemaking, this so-called initiative cobbled together by Russia. Would you agree? The question now is the following. How much of a dead end is this, and how can we get out of it? And will we ultimately have to break ties with the United States of America, our key partner? And could what the Europeans are now warning about actually happen, that Trump might abandon Ukraine?
Well, I think the Europeans are assessing this situation very realistically, although I don't believe that the negotiations are in a completely hopeless dead end just yet. The most profoundly difficult and persistently unresolved issue remains the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces from the entire territory of the Donetsk region. This is precisely the issue that is now front and center because it serves as a marker for how the peace settlement is understood. Is Ukraine capable, willing, and does it want to make this compromise? Obviously, this damages our authority, the position of the Ukrainian government, and so on. And Zelensky, apparently, will defend the position that it is impossible to withdraw Ukrainian armed forces from the lawful, sovereign, internationally recognized Ukrainian territory. And for the Americans, in their system, in their unprincipled system of realpolitik, well, it seems that surviving in this situation is even worse, as the front is in crisis. Mobilization is in crisis, there is corruption within the country, infighting among those in power, increased activity of opposition demands, and so on. But in Trump's opinion, this creates and generates a serious area of internal and external pressure. and as if it's obvious that you supposedly have no trump cards and you need to take certain steps that, in the Americans' view, are rational and reasonable. The problem is, all of this would be fine if it were a war over disputed territories, but in reality, this is a war for Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian territories, the Ukrainian state, and in which the best representatives of the Ukrainian people are dying. For all of Trump's pacifism, he absolutely does not understand the root causes of the Russian-Ukrainian war. That is why lack of principles is his key model of the perception of this war. And this creates a problem for us when we are forced through direct explanation by involving European leaders, by maneuvering flexibly to prove and clarify to Trump the very essence of this ongoing conflict, and to actively counter Russia's persistent initiatives aimed at portraying Ukraine as a nation utterly incapable of achieving peace, and indeed unwilling to genuinely seek a peaceful resolution. In fact, Trump's comment yesterday was exactly about this.
Oleg, why are we seeing this? Is it because Russia skillfully manipulates Trump and we are unable to do so due to certain circumstances? Or is it because we see a deep connection between Trump and Putin, the US and the Russian Federation, and we are witnessing them playing the same game?
Well, all of us. We've all read the national security strategy. I think our viewers are already familiar with its content, or at least the information about it.
It feels like the way it was written, it could end up in another batch of Vitkov and Ushakov tapes being wiretapped, you know? That in the Kremlin, if it wasn't written there, it was definitely approved there.
There are 2 points regarding the appearance of this strategy. The first point is that it's a continuation, an organic continuation of Project 2025. It's a kind of manifesto of the conservatives for the implementation of which Trump, as the leader of the right-wing conservative movement, can act as a figurehead. And the second point concerns the seriousness of this document. This is also about J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich conference this year, where he, perhaps even more harshly than in the articles and formulations, made it clear that yes, America will move in that direction. The new reality of the 2020s in the 21st century is as follows. First, the United States wants to return to classic isolationism. They want to deal with Latin American affairs, Greenland, China, trade and commerce, but they do not want to provide security at their own expense. For other macro regions, particularly Europe. Second, for Americans, it is very important to bring a definitive and lasting closure to the ongoing situation in Eastern Europe related to the Russia-Ukraine war, to liberate their focus and resources from it, and, together with Russian capital, to gain significant opportunities for substantial economic progress in the vast Arctic region, in collaborative ventures for the exploration and extraction of oil and natural gas, in various legal initiatives, and so on. And the third key component is to use Russia. To balance against China, this is the main idea behind Trump's fixation and the war in Ukraine. It stands in the way of achieving this goal, so for him it is extremely important to end it, regardless of how exactly it ends. Trump is not particularly interested in or concerned about that. He needs PR profit, he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, he wants to make it happen. This is his personal vision, his foreign policy doctrine, aimed primarily at withdrawing from Europe. And throughout 2026, we will be observing this trend, because there are already instances where the United States is reducing the number of American troops, for example, at NATO military bases in Romania. And this is already a house of cards that will pull along many other decisions. For example, the desire to reduce the number of Americans in NATO's military command. Until now, only Americans could hold certain command positions in the command of the alliance's joint armed forces. For us Europeans, this is nothing new to them. Let me repeat once again. The Munich conference and Trump's election campaign should have become a point of understanding for Europe, showing what the Americans would be aiming for. We can subjectively judge the Americans. We can accuse them of short-sightedness, of strategic the dangers of such a scenario, but we will discuss, Europeans will discuss, based on their own interests, which is generally understandable and explainable. But now America is turning away from this path. Another question is, how far will the Americans go, and for how long is this strategy intended? Because, well, Trump isn't eternal in the sense that his term will end in 4 years, or rather in 3.5 years. And it's not a given that J.D. Vance or someone else from the Republicans will become president again to continue Trump's course. That's absolutely not a given. But during this 3-year period, for now, this is the scenario that Trump will be carrying out, both ideologically and personally.
We somehow have to get through these 3 years, and ideally survive these 3 years, because then Europe, seeing the cooling of relations with the United States of America, today, both Scholz and Macron said that both Ukraine and the European Union have very powerful cards to play against the Russian Federation. If the situation comes to the point where we have to stop relying on help from the United States, although I don't know what exactly, apart from intelligence data, we could lose, that's so critically important at this point. How strong can Europe become that leader, that partner for Ukraine, so that at the very least they don't let us lose?
Europe. It's not the US, and in some categories of weaponry they can't replace us. Not when it comes to the latest cutting-edge technologies in air and missile defense, not in certain long-range missiles and so on. That's one. The second point. Sometimes the US, in particular, for example, with the Biden administration, it was easier to resolve issues because with Europe it's a collective mechanism. It requires internal, long and lengthy coordination. It requires resolving inter-country and bureaucratic contradictions. It requires a certain powerful campaign. It's important to convey to public opinion in each EU country the importance of continued support for Ukraine. Because, for example, if we look at the latest polls on support for Ukraine in Europe, they vary, yes, for example, in the Scandinavian countries and the Baltics. Roughly speaking, it's one story in Poland and a completely different story in Southern Europe, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Greece. It's a completely different story, and the positions of European governments absolutely correlate with this, with the mood of the masses, and when in some places values prevail that reflect a reluctance to help Ukraine, because supposedly their own budgets are being cut in terms of social spending, and this affects the perception of the war. This creates fertile ground for the idea that it would be better if this war just ended already, so that, for example, energy prices in Europe would stop rising and dragging huge waves of inflation along with them, and so on. In other words, these sentiments are purely pragmatic, they are practical, and they do exist. And Russia is making tremendous efforts to spread and amplify them further through its disinformation resources. And sometimes even some objective inter-party contradictions within each European country. And that's why Europe is not capable of providing Ukraine with stable support. This is also a very important factor, especially when compared, for example, with the United States. If Trump at the time had adopted a different framework for understanding the essence of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and had provided Ukraine with now the kind of more intensive assistance characteristic of Republicans, then perhaps the situation on the front lines would be different. But for now, unfortunately, Europe's resources are also running out. You can clearly see this in the case of the reparation loan, the conflict between Belgium and other European countries. You can see how the latest information really surprised me. Turns out there is frozen assets in France, in commercial banks in France. They absolutely won't make a single move in that direction, not even a hint at confiscation. We also see that, as it turns out, after Hungary and Slovakia, France ranks third in purchasing Russian energy resources. I'm not even mentioning nuclear fuel or the same diamonds we've been talking about for a very long time. I'm not even mentioning agricultural products from Russia, Belarus, and other countries. In reality, when European countries supply the Russian economy, it's a lot. Politics is a complicated thing too. The Washington Post
wrote a correct editorial, a collective one, about how Europe, while warning Ukraine about being abandoned by the United States, sees the speck in America's eye, but doesn't notice the log in its own. And there is a lot of truth in these words. Yes, there is. But the meeting in London, how important is it? How critical is it? Let me remind you from the latest news, it seems to me that not everything is smooth there either. Scholz and Macron left early, supposedly, but these are preliminary reports. But all four leaders refused. So far, they've refused to speak to the press. They don't want to answer journalists' questions yet. How likely is it that someone might change their stance and also put pressure on us regarding territorial concessions on this issue?
Starmer might. British foreign policy is not just dependent, it tends to synchronize with the American line, especially since this is very important for the United Kingdom. Now, as it tries to play the role of a bridge between Washington and the capitals of European Union countries. And this is not the first time that Starmer has tried to maintain these bridges to Washington for himself. Not me, in contrast to Trump and his peace program. At the same time, however, the British are taking an aggressively anti-Russian stance, and it's absolutely public and well known, but nevertheless, that's how it is. Macron and Scholz, on the other hand, understand that stopping the war in Ukraine would automatically pose a threat to the European Union. The increased threat to the European Union, and in general, the enormous risks from America recognizing Crimea and Donbas as Russian, this fear still remains. I repeat once again. I think that this is present in the models of the peace program, which we still don't know about yet. Similarly, the risk of withdrawing troops from the Donetsk region would in fact be an admission of Ukraine's defeat. And this will give Russia a profoundly significant and substantial impetus to strategically plan and execute further overtly aggressive and hostile actions for the foreseeable and extended long-term future, potentially extending up to the year 2030 and even far beyond that time frame. That is why Macron and Markin are quite reasonably concerned about the possibility of Russia consolidating its territorial, political, and economic positions, as well as restoring its Russia's positions in the event of significant concessions from Ukraine that are more compromising than expected.
Well, at least let them impose additional sanctions, even if not at the EU level, but at the level of their individual countries. If they are actually able to do that, of course. For now, this issue needs to be studied carefully. And as for putting pressure on someone, Europe, at this point in time, maybe it's because for now it's just this handful of determined ones, as I call them. They really like to throw around words that don't match their actual actions. They still look to the United States, go to China to pay their respects, but they don't speak the language of ultimatums. Maybe I'm too naive, but still, the European Union is China's #1 market. So can't they just bang their fist on the table and say, China, if you want, we can impose some economic sanctions on you, set tariff restrictions, this will happen, that will happen, and so on. Why are they still pursuing a policy from a secondary position? Remember how it was in the Soviet Union? Second among equals?
Look, this is purely a cultural reason. Europe is not capable, doesn't know how, doesn't want to, and doesn't plan to deal with this. After living for 80 years in a prosperous society where the pursuit of well-being is the main focus for Europeans, obviously this has become almost an axiom of life. And to change something, to break off these relationships, just in case Macron's visit to China. The Europeans gently hinted that there could be tariffs, following the example of the Americans. Because if the Chinese don't stop dumping or don't roll back their export controls, well, that didn't scare the Chinese. If this had happened 10 or 12 years ago, it might have been a different story, but now, no. Europe has lost the pace and taste of that former well-fed diplomacy, as I call it. The time has come for a return to diplomacy, to the traditions before World War II, with that, jackal-like, almost predatory undertone to diplomacy. But Europeans don't know how to play this game. They have procedures, bureaucracy, rules, traditions, norms, rights, and human freedoms. But now, in countries like China, Russia, Iran, and even partly in the US in certain aspects, this is no longer a benchmark for geopolitical structuring and composition. On the contrary, it's more of an obstacle to efficiency and to maximizing the profits or influence of certain macro regions. Europeans don't understand this. It's purely a cultural reason. And secondly, there's electoral dependence. Well, for example, let's say they impose some very serious embargoes against Russia. This will lead to price increases for certain goods in their own countries. This will hurt the current government's electoral position. Everyone wants to stay in power. What will they tell their voters? That they need to endure and tighten their belts. Putin, in his authoritarian country, doesn't have to explain anything to his population. And that's a very convenient and very self-serving situation. But European politicians constantly have to keep an eye on the electoral thermometer, always checking the temperature in the room, and automatically shape their policies based on public sentiment. Well, that's a bug of democracy, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you look at it differently. But for now, Europe can't do without it. They haven't learned how yet. At least not until the right wing comes to power everywhere and starts doing what the right wing Trump is doing in America.
They'll end up waiting not for the right or the left, but for Russian boots to arrive and even make them polish them. Oleg, thank you so much for helping us make sense of the very difficult situation Ukraine has once again found itself in. But it seems that this time the pressure is unprecedented. We will be closely following the news and discussing it together with you as well. Let me remind our viewers that I was speaking with political technologist Oleg Pasternak. Thank you all for your attention and see you next time.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.